There have been times, I think back, might have been before I was with Colorado Business Roundtable, but times where I've missed a few things for my kids that, guess what? I just had to. It was inevitable. Or at times where I was a single mom when my youngest son was at home. And I remember times when I'd come home hungry and tired, he'd show up hungry and tired. We'd kind of look at each other like, who's providing the meal tonight? The funny thing is, he actually learned how to cook during that time in high school because he thought he was the better cook. So he'd
Excellent.
sit me at the counter, he'd start cooking, and we kind of got through it together. But I could feel really bad about how I perhaps let my family down because I wasn't doing everything perfectly.
Hmm.
But we all, there's trade-offs over time. And so different things I had to do for my career were just kind of they were what they were.
Hmm.
And you make the best that you can do, make the best, I guess, decision of what you can do for your family as well. There's no perfection at all.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Habitual Growth Podcast. I have a very special guest on today, Denver's very own Debbie Brown, who is actually the president of the Colorado Business Roundtable. She is leading senior executives from Colorado's largest employers to advance sound public policy and a competitive business climate, which in this day and age is very much needed, which I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit about, Debbie. But previous to that, she founded and led Amplify Strategies, which is a strategic communications and public policy firm, launching and growing multiple organizations. Debbie has also been recognized as a top 25 most powerful women in Colorado, a Denver Business Journal who in the who's who of energy sector. And of course, she serves on the advisory council of the Women's Democracy Network. And that is quite a mouthful, Debbie, because you have done so much in your professional career already. I don't want to butcher that anymore, but tell us a little bit about you behind the scenes. Who is Debbie? How did you end up getting into the role that you are in today?
Well, thank you, Nathan, and excited to be with you and share a little bit more about my life professionally and personally. And yeah, current role is as president of the Colorado Business Roundtable, which I really enjoy. Basically, a wonderful coalition of business executives working to make Colorado's economic climate better, and not only for businesses, but for all the individuals in Colorado that are served by those companies or who are employed by those companies as well. So great to be with you and have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be fun because there's a lot of, I think, behind the scenes economics based on policies and, of course, based on the businesses that help implement those policies to some degree. So I love that we're going to be talking about civic engagement. We're going to be discussing like how we actually shape local policies. But let's just start, right with the Colorado Business Roundtable. I was really not aware of this until my wife introduced us together. As a business owner myself, I'm really interested in learning more about it. So what is the Colorado Business Roundtable and why does it matter to our local economy? And then, of course, the economy outside of Colorado.
Colorado Business Roundtable is an affiliate of the National Business Roundtable based in Washington, D.C., that focuses more on larger employers' viewpoints around business climate, economic issues. And so we follow suit with that here in Colorado. We've got about 100 large employers involved, everybody from large nonprofits, large for-profit entities, large academic systems. So a lot of different types of employers, but we focus on what are the 3 or 4 things we can work on together as a coalition each year or so and advance, again, kind of that high-level business economic climate. And so that's what we are. But really undergirding that is the mission that business is a force for good. So
Mhm.
I think it's a really interesting differentiator too. Not that business is perfect, but
Yeah.
that having good businesses adding to the economy is a force for good.
Absolutely. And just kind of pulling that one layer back, large business is described as kind of what size? Is that an employee size, a revenue size? Kind of how does that fit into the picture?
Yeah, employee size about 500 and up, but
Okay.
most of our businesses are much larger than that. Globally, thousands of employees. So
Okay.
think about Deloitte, IBM, the large university system like the CU system.
Mhm.
Most of our companies, 80% of them are those larger companies that have not only a state focus, but a global lens as well.
Okay. And then those top two, three focus areas that you're working on at a national level, are those directed more based on the local chapters like Colorado, or are they dictated out of kind of Washington, and then everybody is kind of working them in their own maybe local economic circles?
We're independent. Even though we're affiliated with the Business Roundtable, it's an independent
Mhm.
relationship. So
Okay.
our issue set is different than theirs.
Gotcha. So what are the 2 or 3 that you're working on now? What happened in 2025, and is that the same as 2026?
I know. It's you know what? There's never a dull moment. And there's a lot of issues to solve.
Yeah.
Some of the main ones we hear about from our businesses, and Nathan, you can probably relate as an entrepreneur as well, is, uncertainty is tough for business,
Yeah.
economic uncertainty, political uncertainty. Now we're seeing more and more geopolitical uncertainty, which
Mhm.
affect everything from, trade, supply chain, lots of different issues. From a real granular sense for Colorado Business Roundtable, a couple of our bigger issues are around regulatory certainty. So,
Mhm.
working with the Department of Regulatory Affairs on how do we streamline regulations that maybe impede businesses from succeeding as they should. That's one area we work on. Similarly, in workforce, we're involved on streamlining systems so that people looking for good jobs can be paired with an employer looking for a good employer. A good employee more quickly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really interesting you kind of hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of interesting behind the scenes work
Yeah.
that having more employers involved is just practical to make sure policy really accomplishes what it's supposed to.
Yeah, awesome. And I know we're gonna peel this back a little bit more, but one last question on this, and then we're gonna turn it over to you and talk about your professional career, because we want to kind of show people how you got to the role that you're at and what you've been doing in the meantime to really build your own skill sets as well as professionalism. But how do big organizations become a member of the Colorado Business Roundtable?
Well, a part of it is just knowing about us is kind of helpful. We've grown quite a bit ever since COVID.
Mhm.
Have grown really, I think, doubled or tripled since COVID as an organization, which is great. So letting employers know about us. And then to become what we call a partner is not that difficult. Reach out to me and my team, and we're happy to send more information. But it really is similar to like a trade association or a chamber in that there's membership levels and ways to kind of get involved from there.
Awesome. Wow, that's great. And I'm sure that everybody that has a big impact in the local economy needs to be doing that to some degree. I mean, this is how we all work together to create that better economic environment. But let's talk about you for a second, Debbie. I know you went from growing your career from founding and leading a consulting firm. Now you've stepped into this leadership at the Colorado Business Roundtable. You mentor people and organizations globally. But let's talk about kind of that personal journey. And the reason we do this is we like our listeners to go out and apply things that they can do in their own life from people that are experienced like yours. So, just really starting early on in your professional career, what were some of the values that you held close to you that really helped you forge kind of a path to where you are today?
Gosh, what a good question. I love that, Nathan. I'd love to hear yours as well. I hope you can fill me in.
Yeah.
And it's so fun to have people share that. I think one thing that kind of pops to mind is my dad always, and he's since passed away, but he always said, do the right thing.
Mm,
And both my parents have strong Midwestern roots, rural farm families with really zero resources growing up. But the one thing they did have is hard work, and a great work ethic. So do the right thing was always kind of front and center. And he said, I don't always know what it is, but you'll know it. He couldn't always define it, but he's like, that's just a thing to live by. So
yeah.
that was always really helpful to me.
I love that. I love doing the right thing. To me, that says integrity, right? You commit to
Yeah.
something, you're following through with your word. That was a really big thing in my household. And so I would agree with that. From my angle, I've really embraced proactiveness. I think that has, specifically in 2024 and 2025, really helped me define my path forward, getting in front of conversations, going out, not being afraid of almost taking a risk, like putting yourself out there. One of my favorite quotes is from Andy Frisella, and it's just there's no growth in the comfort zone. So it's always good to get in front of other people, join organizations, of course, get yourself involved. And I know we're going to be talking a little bit more about that today.
Yeah, I think of that word intentionality, and that kind of
Yeah,
reminds me of what you just said. Like, how do you, don't think life is just going to happen for you? Like, you've got to have some intentionality to get out
absolutely.
there,
Yeah.
or it just will pass you by.
You got to get in the mix and you've got to direct your own life, right? It's all about that intentional action, intentional thoughts, intentional being intentional about what you're consuming, who you're interacting with, making sure your time, I think, is really well spent. So I like that addition. Let's talk about resilience, though, because obviously that has to be a part of your journey. Resilience specifically in growing an organization, in leading. Sometimes leadership resilience looks a little bit more quiet. It may not be as obvious to outsiders, but how have you maybe grown your resilience internally as you've had different sorts of conversations, as you've had to learn on the job, as you've interacted with more and more global partners? What has that meant to you in your journey?
Yeah, what a great question, too. I think you're right. It's sometimes a quiet journey for people that they have to figure out. You don't just put everything out there.
Hmm.
I think about the resilience for our organization during COVID, for example. I had just become the leader and to some degree had to pivot really quickly, of course, like everybody did. I mean,
Yeah.
it was just such a crazy time. There's no playbook. But it was interesting to sort of think about, okay, what's the resilience and what can be kind of that unique selling proposition to some degree of our organization during COVID. And it really was doubling down on uncertainty that businesses were facing and how could we help solve some of that problem.
Hmm.
And so, learning Zoom really quickly, learning how to tap into our connections in DC so that we were able to give information really quickly to our businesses and the employers that we represent because information was in short supply.
Hmm.
Accurate information was even in shorter supply.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting way, I think, to really kind of have some toughness during that time of leading this organization and going forward.
Did you find, let's just use the COVID example. Did you find that a lot of people were turning to you because they didn't know kind of where else to go? It was almost like this is what's this group is advocating our voice on a local level. We don't really know where to turn, so let's all kind of work together with somebody who was spearheading this for us.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised even some really large businesses reached out and wanted to know what we knew. And maybe we knew let's just say coming out of like the Biden administration at the time. Like what do we know that's coming down from the Biden administration quickly?
Hmm.
If we didn't know, and a lot of times we didn't, but I knew how to try to hustle and figure it out because I realized, okay, that actually is so important to these businesses. These are giant businesses that are trying to figure out their own supply chain issues, their own, how do they stay afloat? How do they qualify for perhaps the status where they're able to stay open? A lot of them were instrumental, needed to stay open during this time. So it was just interesting time to sort of hustle in a different way.
Yeah, kind of figure it all out together. And I'm sure in that chaos, yeah.
Nobody knew what was going on. So providing value to the business community was very important.
Well, and I'm sure stability too, right? You probably found yourself in a scenario where everybody kind of eyeballs were on you of, hey, what direction do we go? How do we navigate this? Just being resilient in that moment, having intentionality, I'm sure really helped. But how did you deal with empathy? Like that's a word that I really
Mhm.
hear quite a bit nowadays. I think in this political environment, you kind of have two different, ends of the spectrum, and then you've got a bunch of gray area in the middle. But I'm sure there was a lot of empathy happening in your end. So how did you kind of put your bias aside and really make sure you're working with everybody for everybody instead of picking a side?
Yeah, and you're not necessarily talking COVID, or are you just talking political climate
Just
generally,
I
or
think
during?
political climate. I think COVID was almost like the crux of it, in my opinion. I'm sure there was a lot of changes pre-COVID, but like post-COVID, it just seems to be a much more dynamic political environment.
Is the dynamic a way, Nathan, of saying divisive and kind of
Yes, yes, it is.
difficult? Yeah. Indeed there. Yeah. I actually feel like it's interesting. I've been involved politically since high school in a lot of different capacities
Hmm.
as a volunteer for many years before I did anything political for a living. And the divisiveness has grown, exponentially over time. I think what's interesting for our role as an organization is we tend to be trusted conveners. We're bipartisan, nonpartisan.
Hmm.
We definitely have a point of view about issues, but we, I think, model how to do it in a way that's not divisive, not mean spirited. And the truth is that's an avenue to be more productive. But I do agree with you. It's a difficult time, I think, right now to try to get things done in sort of that bipartisan, productive way. And I don't
Mhm.
know that I've ever really used the word empathetic. I think that's an interesting word choice, but I think there's a way to accomplish these kinds of issues that we work on in a way that's kind, that's still truthful, that has a point of view.
Mhm.
And I think it's entirely possible. There are folks in the political arena who I think preach that and who model that in a really good way. There's fewer and fewer, but those are the kinds of people I like to model whatever my leadership style after.
Well, how do you, and that's a great point actually. How do you find those people? Because I want to talk a little bit about ego. As a business owner, as a leader of an organization, sometimes we have to be very careful around how big our ego gets, making sure that we're not biased to a greater degree. I think it's okay to have biases, but at the end of the day, right? We want to be open. We want to hear other people. We want to make the best decision possible with the information that's available. So how do you find those people? How do you, for lack of a better term, keep that ego in check as you're helping make these decisions and steer policy for so many people and organizations?
Right. Bias, is just part of the human condition. I always use the phrase more like point of view. Similarly, like people have a set of principles or a set of foundation that they were raised with that might affect their view or affect how they might think about a topic just right out of
Hmm.
the gate.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to find people who can be kind of truth tellers or who can really, I think, help you think about two sides of an issue and then come up with how you might want to think about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you lean on your team a lot of the time to help you make some of these decisions for the direction? Do you follow kind of your own gut instinct, if you will, really following those core values that you ended up growing up with?
hmm I think for the issues that Colorado Business Roundtable weighs in on, we don't weigh in on every issue. We
Okay.
weigh in on a few select issues perhaps each year at the state legislature, a few federal issues. Most of this is pretty common sense, frankly. I mean, they're based on what you would consider kind of good policy for business competitiveness, for overall economic growth. So it doesn't necessarily take too much brain power, I think, to come up with some of the things that we weigh in on.
A lot of collaboration, I'm sure, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like I said, I've been in this mix for a really long time. And so I think that historical context politically is always really interesting, and even
Yeah.
historical context on economic issues. Those are things you can kind of study and look and see as an organization what makes for a good business climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about you for a second in your definition of success, because I know sometimes a lot of business owners, a lot of business leaders will have almost a shift where it's like, hey, I'm going to start a business. I'm, going to do this for money or freedom or my family or something else. But
Yeah.
then the success metric almost changes. So for you, what has been your definition of success? And has there been a moment where you felt like, hey, I've done this, and then you feel like your metric has almost shifted to something else?
In the personal standpoint, more.
Yeah, on the
Yeah.
personal point, yeah, absolutely.
Um, I've always prioritized freedom and flexibility. I've always prioritized that. When I first started my first business, when I was in my mid 20s, I had a growing family, and it was kind of a funny time because it was enough ago, like way back, where I would say my clients didn't know I had kids, my kids didn't know I had clients.
Yeah.
I had this really interesting mix, but that was back in the day when I didn't want to tell a CEO that was my client that I had even just had a baby, because
Yeah.
I felt like, okay, it was generally a lot of men, older men. I
Mhm.
thought they're going to feel bad giving me more work. And the truth is, that's my decision. If I want more projects, that's my decision, not because somebody feels bad giving me a project. So I had a business partner raising young kids, had a lot of flexibility, and it was a fabulous business for that, the flexibility piece. Now I prioritize travel a little bit more. I have a job where I can travel just the right amount. I don't have the same needs in terms of younger children, but what's funny is flexibility and freedom is still a big high point for me, as well as financial payoff, of course. But I really, really like the flexibility I have to take an organization and grow it
Mhm.
in an entrepreneurial fashion as well.
And so one, that's amazing. I need to take notes from you because it is an interesting dynamic, especially with little kids. And I do
Yeah.
remember early on, actually, Bree and I having that conversation when we first started having kids, she was like, I don't know how much I should actually like share with my bosses because that topic actually came up quite a bit, which is truly unfortunate. I do believe like it's not really anybody else's business. Like you're a professional, you should be treated like a professional. But as you kind of shifted, did you have a hierarchy of freedom at the top? You know, I don't know if that means family and then professional career, if that flipped kind of along the way, but did you actually like write that out and then try to live as much by that until your kids get reached a certain age?
Now, I think once you and the entrepreneurs listening might get this. Once you get a taste of the freedom piece, it's hard to go back. I don't know that I would ever be the right fit for like a staunch corporate culture. And COVID has changed that to such a degree, but I think the pendulum shift is now kind of a back to work, sit at your desk kind of, there's different types of environments. I don't think I'd be cut out for that at all. So
Yeah.
it has ebbed and flowed, but I have a taste of freedom in me that's really nice.
You really can't go back. I hear you loud and clear on that one. And it is funny that Brie and we do talk about that all the time because there's nothing like it, right, wrong, or indifferent.
And I think you can have an entrepreneurial mindset within an organization. Like that's a legit, wonderful trait that
Hmm.
I actually think I have. Like I can have different types of work environment for me, but still have an entrepreneurial mindset. But that almost like requires that sense of freedom and flexibility too, to make sure that you can perform with that freedom.
Yeah, 100%. We talked about really intentional actions, intentional thoughts, if you will. I want to move that. I mentioned the word integrity, which I believe kind of we were circling around as well. But what was just in that freedom piece? What was the hardest thing for you personally, maybe to compromise on if you felt like there ever was a compromise? Because really running a business, prioritizing your family and freedom and things like that comes at risks at times. So was there a moment where you actually had to put that on the line and have maybe an internal conversation with yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's not all roses. I think of times when again, I'm kind of overstating freedom and flexibility, but at the end of the day, times work is just work. So there have been times I think back, might have been before I was with Colorado Business Roundtable, but times where I've missed a few things for my kids that, guess what? I just had to. It was inevitable. Or at times where I was a single mom when my youngest son was at home. And I remember times when I'd come home hungry and tired, he'd show up hungry and tired. We'd kind of look at each other like, who's providing the meal tonight? The funny thing is, he actually learned how to cook during that time in high school because he thought he was the better cook. So he'd
Excellent.
sit me at the counter, he'd start cooking, and we kind of got through it together. But I could feel really bad about how I perhaps let my family down because I wasn't doing everything perfectly.
Hmm.
But we all, there's trade-offs over time. And so different things I had to do for my career were just kind of they were what they were.
Hmm.
And you make the best that you can do, make the best, I guess, decision of what you can do for your family as well. There's no perfection at all.
Did you have those conversations openly with your kids and your partner? So now looking back, it's like it really wasn't a sacrifice or a compromise. It was just a decision that was made along the.
Even if it was that well formulated. It's interesting to look back now because my kids are adults
Yeah.
and kind of laugh about it. So we've got some funny stories along those lines. And then there were moments too on the flip side where I'd have I'd be involved in a really, I'd have a client that was a large collaboration of oil and gas companies, was one of my last clients. And they scheduled a 4 p.m. meeting on a weekday when my kid had a playoff game, a high school playoff game where he's a starter. And I'm like, see ya. Like I'm not missing the playoff game. We all kind of make choices. But the tricky
Okay.
part, I think, from that ethical decision is knowing, what, when you've got to have your nose to the grindstone, which I had plenty of that, and when, frankly, family takes priority and you let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah. That's great sound advice. I kind of have this internal monologue with myself now. My eldest is 7, so still relatively young, but we're starting to get into sports, and it's becoming several nights a week, and the other siblings are following along, and I'm starting to have to make some of those decisions myself. So it's always interesting to hear from people that look back after they've had to make those decisions and then live through whatever repercussions or consequences that come out of that.
For sure. For sure. It's hard to miss games, but like a state playoff game, that's that's still
That's a big
like,
one.
yeah.
That's a big one. Let's talk about the Colorado Business Table and just the line using business as a force for good. Because oftentimes I feel like that is coached into entrepreneurs along the way, partnering
Yeah.
with nonprofits. If you're doing good, your business is going to thrive and do good as well. But sometimes it honestly feels like the goals don't always align one for one. So when you've got profit, when you've got policy, advocacy, and community, and they're all kind of pulling you in different ways, how should leaders really decide what they need to prioritize in that moment or in those moments?
Yeah, we have several big events a year, which are fun that bring people in from the business community. And one event we had, I think it was a year and a half ago or so, with an entrepreneur here in town, Dan Caruso, who's founded lots of different businesses. And I think he said it really well. He said only profitable companies can be purposeful. So I think they misunderstand the importance of being a profitable company and supporting companies in making money. Because if you're not a profitable company, according to Dan Caruso and according to me as well, you can't be purposeful. It's not a thing. And so I think that's part of our mantra around business as a force for good is
Mhm.
frankly, just being a company, being profitable, that makes you a force for good. You've hired people, you've paid benefits, you're paying tax revenue, all the things you've already done before you even think about your philanthropic endeavors are
Mhm.
amazing. During COVID, businesses were just trying to keep their doors open for a
Yeah.
year or two. And so, the fact that they were striving so hard to make that happen was just amazing. So we can get into some of that, the valuable products and services. And then on top of that, I think is kind of the icing on the cake is that so many businesses are involved in philanthropic efforts, that fit their strategic objectives. It could be
Mhm.
around sustainability or veterans or homelessness, but all of that cumulative is kind of how we think about business as a force for good.
Awesome. I do want to pull on that. And I'm going to throw something at you that's always stuck with me because, one of my businesses out here, we work with Companies Doing Good, which is a local nonprofit in Colorado owned by one of my friends. I don't run a major business by any means, but as we've grown, we made decisions really early on the philanthropic side that is like you can never be too small to give back. And if you build that in as part of your kind of operating model, if you do that early on and just say, hey, this is just going to be a part of our expenses or our cost, but it's important to us. We want to live this lifestyle and show that you don't have to be a bigger organization to do this. Let's talk about that a little bit and when that force for good really maybe hits the inflection point of profitability to be a force for good.
Yeah, I think the trick in some of that is that people haven't I've seen situations where people try to put that in a box. If you're a company and you're doing good in this certain way, then
Mhm.
okay, we think you're good.
Yeah.
It's hard to put businesses in a box. And again, entrepreneurs get that.
Yeah.
Everybody has a different business model. I'll give you an example. We've got some construction companies that are a part of Colorado Business Roundtable that what they invest in workforce training is phenomenal. Like you just can't even believe how much they support workforce pathways. They work with the higher ed system, workforce system to try to streamline pathways to make it easier for people in the construction fields, to get an associate's degree that stacks to a bachelor's degree that means something. Now, is that philanthropic dollars? Not really, but is it dollars that sort of amplify business as a force for good?
Mhm.
And I could give you examples of different types of business and industries that I think do so much that is sort of outside the box of what you might think of as just philanthropic endeavors.
Yeah,
And
let's
the way
take
they
some of
do
those
that
examples.
too. But it's just so interesting to see. I just have a firsthand view of what all these companies are doing that's just so phenomenal.
Yeah, let's take a couple of those examples. I think that is an important piece of this conversation is really shining a light, maybe getting people to think a little bit differently of what some of the terms mean or force for good can mean. So it isn't just the traditional giving money to a nonprofit or charity or some sort of philanthropic organization.
Right. Right. Pulling on that thread, seeing so much of that in the construction industry because there's such a need for more folks getting in.
Hmm.
So I use that as an example, thinking of another business like a Lockheed Martin. I think about some of our aerospace companies that have these internships and exposure for high school students to come into the aerospace industry. In fact, they have efforts again on that workforce side of bringing people in who don't have college degrees, who can come and get exposed to aerospace degree to aerospace careers and kind of find pathways in. Um, Sponsoring Aerospace Day at the Capitol for students. That's a whole nother example. As you might know, Nathan, aerospace is such a big, big employer here in Colorado. So that's an industry we work closely with as well.
Yeah, I love that, and honestly, I didn't realize how big it was. I went to see you, and
Oh, yeah.
I really didn't realize how big of an industry it was until I was driving down 470 a couple of years ago, and I saw the building for Blue Origin, which I just thought was incredible. I was familiar with Lockheed and the other big aerospace, but I wasn't actually aware that some of the bigger like space organizations were moving in as well, which I think is really awesome.
Yeah. I mean, a fun fact for you, Colorado is the highest per capita aerospace employer in the country as a
Wow.
state. California is bigger in raw numbers, but per capita, Colorado has everybody beat,
Oh,
which
I
is a
did
great,
not.
great
Yeah, I
stat.
did not know that. I'm going to spread that word for sure, because I have a
I
lot
know,
of
yeah, potential
friends trying to break in.
customers for you. A lot of companies, there's a couple big companies that are sort of anchored here,
Mm,
like a Lockheed Martin. But when you think about their supply chain and their reach, it's amazing how many small and medium-sized companies are affected by and are part of that ecosystem within a
mm.
Lockheed Martin. So it's big and small together that are being helped. All the boats are rising.
Yeah, that makes sense. Bringing everybody up together, which is great. Let's talk about just pulling on kind of the thread of different ways organizations can kind of maybe open up their doors to different levels of policy, helping out both employees, internships, things like that. Are there maybe blind spots that a lot of leaders or organizations don't think about until they get engaged with you? So, for an example, internship programs, or like you said, opening the doors for individuals that may not have college degrees in an otherwise very technical, very degree oriented profession.
In terms of how that's affected by public policy, is that kind of the
Policy, but maybe how leaders think about organizations. And then after they become involved either in the business roundtable or how after seeing other examples, they maybe shift their leadership style or close some of the blind spots to open up new opportunities for people.
I'll give you an example of that. We were involved in the second annual Human Potential Summit as an example. First one was held here in Colorado. The second one just happened in Utah. And it's a great convening of businesses to do that, like learn best practices from each other.
Mhm.
Think about what's happening. I use the example of what's happening in the construction industry. It's called Project Scale. How can
Okay.
other industries sort of take what's already being done there, largely led by employers, and take that into other industries like the healthcare sector, for example? So businesses are learning from each other on best practices. And I think that competitive spirit and that kind of free market system, I think churns it up a little bit too, where people are trying to always constantly improve. So that's one example of how businesses are sharing with each other. The flip side I might add is to some degree, I think businesses help speed up policy integration by public policy folks in a way that's super productive because there's nothing like the speed of business. It's faster than the speed of government typically or the speed of that kind of bureaucracy. And so when we're able to combine business leaders to talk about speed, relevancy, ROI, and how it's adopted in public policy, it helps speed up, I think, good work from the government side as well.
That's
And we've
that
seen that.
makes what's that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And we've seen that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's exciting because we sort of can push on that because guess what? That helps people, especially in the workforce side, people to achieve their dreams faster if
Yeah.
there is that element of ROI, relevancy, and speed.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue because I want to talk about the responsibility that almost comes with that, right? Enacting policy, both maybe for you in the Colorado Business Roundtable, but also business leaders, because there are obligations to shareholders, there are obligations to workers, their families, the environment, future generations, kind of everything that you could possibly stack up. So how do you talk through or maybe use examples with those business leaders with your team about balancing moral obligations and the responsibilities as businesses grow?
For business leaders and what their responsibility is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of responsibilities if you're thinking of a business owner or a C-suite. They've got a lot of stakeholders in play,
Right.
not just actual shareholders, but all the stakeholders involved in terms of how they run their business, how they think about growth or what they're trying to accomplish in terms of products and services. I really mostly see really positive examples of how people are balancing that. And I think weighing in on public policy, using their voice in the public square is one of those ways that actually we see businesses, I think, being good citizens, giving sort of practical advice to policymakers on what helps a business climate grow or contract when we're in this competitive world where businesses can set up a shop here in Colorado and grow, or they can choose to set up a shop somewhere else and grow.
Makes sense. And I'm curious because you have firsthand experience, right? You get probably the best vantage point just for the various industries and verticals that you're working in, with all the different companies that you're working with. When you are engaging in areas like tax policy, infrastructure, workforce, education, again, everything else that impacts local economies and people, do you know, or do you have a kind of a perspective of what helps shape like Colorado? Let's just use Colorado as the example. So the local environment more than any of the other areas, or do they all work hand in hand collectively?
Well, they definitely work hand in hand, but different levers, I think, at different times will affect whether we see a strong economic outlook. We polled about 50 companies this fall to see just basic, how are they thinking about capital expenditures in the next 6 months? How are they thinking about hiring in the next 6 months? Trying to get a sense of sort of this quantitative viewpoint. And we'll be doing this kind of a survey every 6 months. The Business Roundtable nationally does this kind of a survey quarterly. And so we were hoping to kind of butt it up against that to see what are some federal trends versus some Colorado trends. And it's interesting, cost of doing business is always at the top in terms of how people see the Colorado business climate. And then workforce and uncertainty are also at the top.
That's interesting. And I'm sure it's always a moving target, right? Taking COVID, I'm sure it was keeping doors open, keeping people employed, understanding what they can do is going to be more important than immediate environmental impacts, just speculating, right? And then it'll pivot to something else as, companies grow and things change over time. From the top, let's talk about business leaders though. Are there habits, because you did mention the habits that a lot of organizations have, but the leaders specifically, are there habits that you see in your role that most leaders do when they become engaged? So when they're balancing maybe ethical leadership that they're working on consistently over time to make sure they're making the right decisions for their company, the stakeholders, and the local economy.
One thing that comes to mind is, kind of an oldie but goodie management by walking around. And I saw this recently when we were working with some of our covert folks that are more kind of on the policy space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it ties in nicely. It was more about, okay, if we're thinking about a human-centric approach or thinking about how policy affects people, one of the questions I asked this group in particular was, well, when was the last time you've been on the floor of a business? Mm-hmm. And I kind of got some inquisitive looks like, oh, well, maybe it's been a while.
Yeah.
And I just think about these are leaders that are more on the policy oriented, but I took them on a field trip to see a business because it had been a while. And it really is that sense of how do you, again, see people out, working on products, hearing from apprentices. This was in the construction sort of realm. But how do you actually see the people that you're trying to help and knowing, okay, now I know the why of why I'm putting into place these different policies because I've seen the people who are impacted.
Yeah.
And the same, I could come up with the same kind of idea again for private sector leaders, but I thought that was really fascinating to see the people that you're trying to help.
And it's really hard to do in everything I've seen, right? Because you have so much to manage. You have so many things to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Again, using the word intentional, it just takes so much intentionality to say, no, this is a priority. I really need to get conversations instead of being a part of this, phone line or, communication channel that isn't really getting me into the trenches with the real people doing the real work.
Right. And we're actually getting ready to we've been invited to take a group of people, actually speaking of aerospace, to a rocket launch here in about a month. And it's interesting to think of like, well, why would business leaders and policy leaders, one, it's kind of cool, but is there a deeper why? And it's interesting talking to some of the folks that I work with, again, with Colorado Business Roundtable, the why is, these are employees here in Colorado who are building not only products we use every day, like GPS or our phones or satellite, but it's our national security, it's our economic security. Like the technology that's being built is so phenomenal. But to see what's being built here in Colorado actually being launched in Cape Canaveral is going to be pretty phenomenal. But it's tying that why together. Why do we do the work we do?
So that's amazing. I was actually talking to my son. He's really into rockets. Every time there's, a new Glenn or a Starship launching, we always tune in on YouTube. And I told him I want to take him down there sometime soon to see one of those launches.
I'll get you on the next list.
That would be amazing. I would love
Yeah.
that, and I will happily go. It's been
Okay.
something I've always wanted to see there.
Good.
But that's what's really interesting and inspiring, and I love about it. And I love the fact that you said, we get people together to almost information share. Here's the things that we are doing. Here's what we're dealing with. You open up those communication channels. But what do you say to people that maybe are skeptical of business involvement in public policy? Specifically when it comes to critics that really misunderstand the responsibility that businesses have at a local level.
I think there are a lot of critics of business being involved. Thankfully I'm not one of them because I really am a believer. I love what I do. I love representing. I feel honored to represent business. We're fortunate that everybody gets to use their voice in our political system, whether it's local, state, federal, or otherwise. Everybody gets the chance to use their voice, even people who represent the business community. I think there is a tension there, though. That's part of the trick of politics. There's competing principles, competing priorities, and elections are tricky. They have definite consequences, and people should pick what issue or what candidate they feel like they have some alignment with and get involved. It's kind of up to everybody to show up in the public square.
Yeah, I actually love that response. That's so great, Debbie, because there's so many things that people complain about, but it's usually because there's lack of involvement. The misunderstanding oftentimes comes from, well, I read this on X or I saw this on Facebook or wherever, but there really is so much that's in the background that's happening. And actually a lot of the issues, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, come well after decisions have been made or policies have been implemented. And so, it takes, I'm sure, 6 months plus to have the discussions, to get the feedback, to pick a direction, to make the decisions that actually implement the policy. Do you see a lot of the timelines being either not frustrating, but just that is a big thing that plagues some of the policy and economic impacts of the policies themselves?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you've got, again, policymakers who might make a decision one year and really the effects are much later. So you can make some predictions of how you think, it'll affect the economy. I'll give you an example. I used to work in doing some political consulting for the oil and gas industry here in Colorado, who I think are just the salt of the earth people and what they do for us so that we can have heat and hot showers. And I mean, it's wonderful. And there were policies put into place many years back here in Colorado that really some folks, including me, were saying this is going to be a downfall for the industry here in Colorado. And at the time, it didn't happen immediately, but over time, you see less and less companies willing to invest here.
Yep.
They're going to go invest where it's easier, where the business climate wants their, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. And you're seeing the industry just really change here in Colorado, which is so unfortunate because we have the ability to be one of the top producers of oil and natural gas in a very safe, clean way here in Colorado. So it took many years and it's still sliding out, but it's not a good game for our state to have businesses dry up.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, that's a perfect example. I used to work for Shell Oil and
Oh,
Marathon in
okay.
LA. So,
Yeah.
I haven't been in the industry for about 10 years now, but I had, firsthand knowledge of what was going on behind the scenes, where everything was coming from, the supply chains, the infrastructure, customer impacts. And it's fascinating to see almost the lack of a better term, like the marketing policies that come out of it, versus the practicality of what the economic drivers are for those businesses in that environment. And so I guess maybe a personal question for you, how do you navigate some of that, what I would call just tension, which is like the economic competitiveness, right? What
Mhm.
more of the critical voices are versus ensuring the policies don't leave some of these groups in organizations in vulnerable positions, because that is a reality.
It is. And it was funny when you were talking, I thought of this analogy that I had a mentor years ago. I used this analogy and I always thought this was so brilliant, especially since the Broncos are so good. Let's use a football analogy.
Perfect.
So say that you're thinking about public policy and how it affects a state. This was a mentor of mine. He called it a refereed free market system. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And his point was if you're playing a game, you need referees. A business community needs referees. That's fair. You need people who are going to be figuring out common sense, basic regulatory framework. Like a football game, the question might be how many referees? Do you need one referee? For the Broncos, no, you probably need more than one referee. But do we need 100 referees? No, the 100 referees would impede the game. It would make it where it's not productive. It would impede the game. So I kind of think about, especially for people who don't think about politics or don't think about their business voice, it's kind of a fun analogy. Like,
Yeah.
what's the right amount of regulation? Most people aren't saying no regulation, right? It's really a matter of what's the right amount from who. There might be some industries that are super overregulated. You can figure out how to streamline, and others that might need a little more.
Mm.
But the point is, it's not 100 referees.
Yeah.
That wouldn't make any sense.
That's a great analogy. I love that. And I'm going to steal that for future conversations, by the way. Let's talk about deregulation, actually, because that is a really fascinating point. How often do you find that you are actually working towards deregulating industries versus regulating more industries, putting more referees in the game?
There's always a ton, and we don't spend a ton of time at the state capitol as an organization. There's several business organizations here that's really, they're the tip of the spear. We might weigh in on 4 or 5. I
Okay.
think it's very rare to have any conversations around deregulation is like shaking. It just
Yeah.
doesn't happen very often. Like I said, we're involved in a few of those, which will be really good. But I think it'll be really tricky to take regulations away and streamline is a very arduous process.
Yeah. Yeah, I would assume as much. And that is, part of the churn. That is why sometimes it takes so long to get things to move is because of the regulation. And, I'm a big proponent of deregulation, but I understand that there is a balance, right? Let's talk really quickly about voices, the players in the game. Sometimes I don't want to use critics, but there's an expectation that the bigger voices have the bigger lobbying groups because they have the more profitability. So therefore they can spend in various categories. How do you balance the larger voices that sometimes may have the larger capital budgets from outweighing the smaller players that are just kind of getting into the game?
I think there's a place for everybody. I think business voices are really around coalitions. I'll give you an example. The Denver Metro Chamber, they talk about 80% of their members are small business, and they're a big, voice here in Colorado as the Denver Metro Chamber. People can join the national, gosh, I can't think of what it is, there's quite a few organizations that specialize in small business voice. And sometimes small businesses have a different viewpoint than larger businesses. But I would say there's a coalition for everybody to join and to make sure they're having their voice heard. And it's okay that people have a differing opinion. I think that's part of what hopefully makes our public square interesting. Like, again, I would hope that it would be civil and productive. Not everybody always agrees. That's just part of how life works. But everybody, I think, can find an organization that helps amplify their voice.
100%. That is the benefit of where we live. That is one of the things I think that works really well, specifically here, is just being able to get a lot of voices to the table and force yourself to work through some of these issues. It's also why I love the personal characteristics aspects of these, because there is one individual, usually, I'm sure there's maybe 2 or 3 from each organization, sitting down having these conversations. And with that said, from a leadership perspective, from maybe those organizations, what fears would you recommend that they work on getting over? Whether that's being ineffective or naive on certain topics. Are there mindset shifts that you oftentimes see when new players come to the table that they have to work through in order to have a bigger voice when it comes to their organization?
I usually, especially people who are kind of new to the space, I think about context is key. To understand political context, almost history of, maybe even, this sounds kind of boring, like economic systems, history of political change here in Colorado, or federal history as well. And we have an event coming up with the governor around his priorities, sort of his legacy as he's getting ready to leave office this next year.
Mhm.
But we're going to have someone actually stand up before we talk about kind of that legacy piece and give even some historical context on Colorado's economy. The last 150 years, what were some key points? What's happened in the past? How do we look at the future? And I think context is really important. It helps people, I think, not just think, not every problem is new. So how do we think about the past? How do we learn from the past? I think is a really good lesson.
Yeah, be that lifelong learner. Ask,
Mhm.
be proactive again, go out and really seek information. Is you're right. I mean, context matters, and you start with a little bit of information, but a little bit of information can be a dangerous thing, especially in the wrong hands. And so when you have more information, usually you understand that you're not the first person to think of that. It's not the first time Colorado or any other business environment has gone through something like that.
Right.
And so there is a lot that can be done just from that educational piece.
Yeah. Nathan, have you been involved in public policy or like volunteered on an issue or thought about an issue in particular on this?
I have not. That's a great question. I have not at a business level. I do from a mentorship and more of like a founder entrepreneur level, but
Mhm.
not in a public policy space.
I'm excited to introduce you to some of that in the future and have you come to some covert events and kind of, stretch your mind a little bit in a different way.
Well, I would love that. And that is, that aligns very well with kind of some of my goals that I have for 2026, which are getting more involved. And, just circling kind of back to what we had talked about a little bit earlier in the conversation, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you become involved, you understand what levers may need to be pulled, how you can make an impact, how you can educate yourself. Because I live here, this is a part of my economy. I am a business owner. And so I need to understand kind of what goes into that.
Well, that'll be fun. It's surprising how easy it is. Like I volunteered for my first campaign in high school. I was doing lots of just finding interesting people that I wanted to volunteer for. I mean, it's pretty shockingly easy to get involved in campaigns and causes, oddly enough. Like I don't necessarily think what we're doing with Covert is a campaign or a cause, but it's interesting for folks who want to have their voice heard. It's not all that tricky.
Well, that is kind of my last question as we're wrapping up here, Debbie. I really want you to expand on that a little bit more. And that is, for our listeners, whether you are a business leader who is maybe running a small business, not there yet, to large organizational leaders, if you're a listener, what would you tell them if they want to contribute to policy, being a community member, engaging in civic responsibility, even if it doesn't hold like formal power? Where should they start? What can they be doing right now?
I almost lean towards what we were just talking about with context first. I tend to have a broad array of news outlets for me that help me sort of make sure I'm really understanding context of even current day situations. So I might listen to CNN and then listen to a little Fox News. I might listen to a little bit of NPR and a little bit of, this show. And I've got some podcasts I think that are really interesting. So I definitely encourage people to challenge themselves with listening to making sure they have a wide variety of news sources and places where they can understand then how do they formulate what they believe as opposed to just one type of news source. I think that context is really, really helpful. And even books. Books are a thing, right? Could probably help recommend a couple books that I think are just wonderful reads again for context. And then the cool part of finding your voice in the political square is there's a place for you to have that vehicle. For example, if you care about like we both came from energy issues, there'd be an organization that might help someone who's in an energy profession who wants to have a little bit more of a voice out there. There'd be some entities like Colorado Oil and Gas Association or Denver Petroleum Club where they could go and find a place to have that outlet. If someone cared about veterans, for example, and veterans policy and veterans funding and what's happening in that space, there are organizations like Colorado Veterans Project that would gladly take a volunteer for some of the good work that they do. So I think there's no perfect answer for an individual, but I think there's always a great vehicle or an outlet to go volunteer your time.
Yeah.
The other thing is for candidates, find a candidate who has your value set and offer to, volunteer for a campaign. It's a fun way to learn how to just utilize your voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I love those too. And I'm going to add from my own personal vantage point, just make the decision to get involved. I think it really starts there of, hey, this is your backyard, whether you're in Colorado or somewhere else, right? If it's the Colorado Business Roundtable, if it's, a different state in the Business Roundtable, but get involved, make the decision, understand that your voice has meaning, your decisions impact others. And so, as Steve Jobs likes to say, stay foolish. I love that quote just from the, hey, get involved, follow your curiosity, go meet some people, understand who else is making decisions, who else is impacting your life that you may not even know about. And you can lead to really fruitful relationships and growth for your business and personal development.
For sure. And I would just say, I've challenged myself recently. I know part of what you do with your podcast and your really good work is challenge people to, all right, you got to keep constantly being challenged. I started challenging myself several years ago to get involved globally, particularly with women who have much less of a voice in some countries like Afghanistan or
Mm.
Rwanda, where I've been able to mentor women on finding their way in terms of political participation, and it's so interesting coming from the freedom that we have here in Colorado, the freedom I have as a female here to grow a business or lead an organization. How do I take some of the things I've learned and then help particularly these women in emerging democracies has been just one of the joys of my life. So it's fun to sort of think of like that next challenge, and that's something I've embraced as well.
Wow, that is one, amazing that you're challenging yourself in those ways. Two, that sounds like a fantastic follow-up podcast because I am
Oh,
so fascinated by that, especially in the political changing environment. So good for you for doing that. That's very impressive. And with that said, Debbie, I know we're kind of winding up here. How can people get in touch with you? How can people get in touch with the Colorado Business Roundtable specifically?
yeah, I appreciate that. We welcome your listeners to come and check us out. The website is cobrt.com. You can sign up for our emails, see what events we have popping up. We have 3 external events a year, and we'd love to have people get involved with us.
Absolutely. And with that, thank you again for your time. This has been phenomenal. I've already learned so much. I'm looking forward to our rocket launch and sitting down and talking more Colorado economics with you. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us. We're going to tag the Colorado Business Roundtable and all the videos, as well as Debbie specifically, so you can get in touch with her. Please do reach out, especially if you are here in Colorado. Make the decision to get involved, find somebody that is making an impact, that is making some of these leadership decisions, and get yourself involved because you never know what kind of impact or ripple effect you are going to have. So with that, thank you for listening. Debbie, again, pleasure, and we will talk soon.